Writing in the Devil's Dictionary, Ambrose Bierce once said that history is an account, mostly false, of events mostly unimportant, which are brought about by politicians, mostly knaves, and soldiers, mostly fools. Now, this is very cynical, but every time I think of this, I'm struck by how true it often is. Because no one who's even passingly familiar with the kinds of nefarious purposes to which what purports to be history has been put by those who are either in power or eager to curry favor with those in power can doubt that this is true in some important way. Now, what I want to talk to you about today is an example of exactly this sort of thing. It's an example of how history has been used to lie about something very important, and which has wound up greatly benefiting those in power in the United States. Now, of course, I am referring to World War II. I am referring to what another YouTube user by the name of lengthyounarther referred to as the modern American civic religion. And it's a great term to use because World War II and the stories surrounding it really do form the creation myth of the modern American state. Now, I don't want to talk about all of World War II. That's far too extensive a topic, but I do want to talk about one specific aspect of American involvement in that war, namely the start of it. I want to talk about why the United States declared war on Germany. Now, the standard account of why this happened is pretty open and shut. Essentially, it's just this. On December 7th, 1941, the American fleet in the Pacific at Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japan. A completely unprovoked attack, by the way. It's according to this conception, and that's also wrong. But I don't want to go into that. But after this attack, on December 11th, 1941, Adolf Hitler came out and issued a very bellicose, very rabble-rousing speech in which he ultimately declared war on the United States, and then a few hours later, the United States responded in kind and declared war on the Hitler regime. Now, what I am here to tell you is that account is completely false. It's completely wrong. Completely untrue. And what is all the more astonishing is that the evidence showing that this is the case has been completely ignored by historians today. A comprehensive reading of the American press shows that it was not the German declaration of war on the United States that ultimately inspired the fervor in America for returning the declaration of war and going to war with Germany. What inspired the desire to declare war on Germany and to make war with the Third Reich was the belief that Germany was ultimately responsible for the Pearl Harbor attack. Now, that is an astonishing statement. Let me clarify what I mean. Everyone understood, even then, that it was the Japanese that attacked Pearl Harbor, but an incredibly prevalent belief at the time was that it was actually the Germans who had put them up to it. That the Germans had issued a command to the Japanese urging them to attack Pearl Harbor, telling them to do so, and the Japanese essentially obeyed. There were also further theories about how German engineers and scientists had gone to Japan to construct planes and military equipment for them and so forth to enable them to carry out this attack. There were even, for a time, eyewitness reports proliferating in the press that alleged that the planes seen at Pearl Harbor were German planes and that many of them were manned by blonde-haired, presumably German pilots. Not only this, but on December 12th, 1941, the German government issued a statement wherein it said that Hitler's speech of the day before was not intended as a declaration of war on the United States and that Germany had no desire to fight a war with the United States. And the interesting thing about this is that in the press at the time, this was completely ignored. All major newspapers and opinion leaders converged on the opinion that declarations of war as such were merely cosmetic things. They were formalities of little importance, and that what really mattered was the fact of German aggression against Pearl Harbor. So, Germany did not actually declare war on the United States, or at least did not intend to. And the American public acknowledged this and ignored it because they believed that the Germans were responsible for the Pearl Harbor attack. Now, what's astonishing is historians today completely ignore this. Now, I realize that what I have just said is astonishing and unbelievable and probably surprising to many of you. So, in order to substantiate what I've said, I'm going to be making reference for a while to a book I found, an excellent book, by Richard F. Hill, called Hitler Attacks Pearl Harbor, and the subtitle of it is Why the United States Declared War on Germany. And Hill investigates precisely this question. Now, rather than simply taking my word for it, that many American newspapers around the time of Pearl Harbor were accusing Germany of either complicity in the attack, some kind of involvement in it, or of outright commanding the attack, of ordering it. Rather than insisting that you take my word on this, I'm going to read a few relevant quotes to this effect. So, for example, regarding the imminent U.S. declaration of war on Japan, this is after Pearl Harbor, the United Press reported on the morning of December 8th that, quote, President Roosevelt will address a joint session of Congress at 12:30 p.m. today and may ask recognition that a state of war exists between the United States and Japan, and possibly with Germany and Italy. Now, why would Germany and Italy be included in this list here if it was the German declaration of war that inspired the American declaration of war on Germany? Obviously, this headline from an article published on December 8th, 3 days before the German declaration, is not explained by this theory. You can go further. For example, the Omaha Morning World Herald also had a similar headline that day, on December 8th. FDR calls Congress, may ask for war, press seeks advisors, declaration against Nazis in Italy hinted, foes of Roosevelt swing to his support. You can go further. A newspaper like the the Sacramento Union. Well, actually, no. Before that, let me go to the Chicago Tribune, which was a formerly isolationist newspaper. Before Pearl Harbor, the Chicago Tribune was the premier non-interventionist newspaper in the United States. And the Chicago Tribune said in its morning edition of its December 9th paper that, according to the White House, the president is not considering a declaration of war on Germany and Italy. The United States is now engaged in an undeclared war with Germany and Italy, but whether it becomes formalized appears to be up to Hitler for the time being, at least. Now, this was, as I said, the December 9th morning edition, and the previous day, of course, all the newspapers around the country had been predicting that Roosevelt would address Congress and ask for a declaration of war on Germany as well. This did not happen, and so they began speculating on why. And you of course, you can note the Chicago Tribune says that there exists already an undeclared war between Germany and the United States. Now, if there exists an undeclared war prior to any declarations, then it couldn't have been the German declaration of war that was the impetus for the United States going to war with Germany. It just doesn't fit. Now, what else is interesting is, I mean, you can look at other opinion leaders. Take Frank Kent, a major columnist writing for the Cincinnati Enquirer. He writes on December 10th, though Mr. Roosevelt did not say so in his address to Congress, will any realistic man contend that the issue is merely between Japan and the United States? Too clearly it is between the Axis powers and ourselves. Hitler is the real enemy, and it is all one battle. We are in it now, up to the hilt and to the end. The President has made it clear that Germany was and is behind Japan in the war thrust upon us. So, once again, you see what the prevalent opinion was. Hill also makes reference to many opinion polls. He shows that prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, depending on what poll you looked at, anywhere between 70 and 80% of Americans were against declaring war on Germany, even if Germany declared war on the United States. The majority of Americans prior to Pearl Harbor thought that the notion of a German declaration of war on the United States was just an irrelevant matter and could be safely ignored. They only favored declaring a war on Germany if Germany actually attacked the United States. However, a Gallup poll on December 10th, this is after Pearl Harbor, showed that now 90% of Americans were in favor of declaring war on Germany. Now, why is this? What could have happened that resulted in this enormous shift in opinion? Most people were against declaring war on Germany, even if there was an overt German declaration of war on the United States, and then after Pearl Harbor they favored it, nearly unanimously. It was because most everyone at the time believed that Germany was ultimately responsible for the Pearl Harbor attack, that they either ordered Japan to do so or at least had aided Japan in the effort and were in that way complicit in what happened. Now, what else is interesting is you can look not only at public opinion and journalists, but also the statements of major congressional leaders. Take, for example, Senator Claude Pepper. Let's see. Right, now, Claude Pepper was taken to be essentially considered the congressional mouthpiece for the views of the Roosevelt administration at the time. Whatever the Roosevelt administration believed was essentially what Pepper believed, and so if you knew what Pepper's beliefs were, you could get an accurate picture of what the Roosevelt administration was thinking. And Pepper made a statement to the effect that it really didn't matter if Germany chose to declare war on the United States. If it did, that would be Germany's prerogative as a nation, but it would also be the prerogative of the United States to ignore this declaration of war and not to do anything about it. Furthermore, now, President Roosevelt, probably for strategic reasons, was very reticent when it came to making overt declarations about foreign policy, because, as those of us familiar with the history know, he was in fact trying to manipulate the United States into war in the years leading up to Pearl Harbor, unsuccessfly, and then finally successfully after Pearl Harbor. But because of this attempt at manipulation, he was very he chose his words very carefully. He was very careful to make too many overt declarations, and so his foreign policy pronouncements were few and far between, and so when he made them, they carried enormous weight, and the press pounced on them. Now, what is astonishing is Roosevelt's opinion on the question of whether or not a German declaration of war on the United States would be sufficient to induce the United States to declare war on Germany in kind. And according to him, according to something that Roosevelt himself leaked to the press on October 4th, 1940, so this is way back, according to him, the answer is no. I'm going to read an astonishing quotation to you from Roosevelt that shows this. This is, you have to hear this to believe it. He was having a conversation at the time, this is October 4th, 1940, with House Speaker Sam Rayburn and floor leader John McCormick. Roosevelt mused that, quote, Hitler and Mussolini and Japan, united, might feel that if they could stop American munitions from flowing to England, planes, guns, ships, airplanes, ammunition, and so forth, that they could lick England. Now they might send us an ultimatum. If you continue to send anything to England, we will regard that as an attack on us. FDR emphasized this point by rapping on his desk. And I'll say, I'm terribly sorry, We don't want any war with you. We have contracts, and under our neutrality laws, any belligerent has a right to come and buy things in this country and take them away. They'll thereupon say, well, if after such and such a date you are continuing to ship munitions to England and planes, we will regard you as a belligerent. All right, what have we got to say to this? I'll say, I'm terribly sorry. We don't consider ourselves belligerent. FDR here began to chuckle. We're not going to declare war on you. If you regard us as a belligerent, we're dreadfully sorry for you, because we don't. Now, all we can say to you is that, of course, if you act on that assumption, that we're a belligerent, and make any form of attack on us, we're going to defend our own. We're going to defend our own, and nothing further. So there you go. FDR himself saying that declarations of war as such are unimportant, and that what mattered when it came to the United States joining the war, or getting involved in the war, were overt acts of war, attacks on the United States. So again, it cannot possibly be that the German declaration of war on the United States was the motivation behind the U.S. Jumping in. Now, you could of course ask the question, if it was so widely believed that Germany was ultimately behind the attack on Pearl Harbor, why then did Roosevelt wait for Hitler to deliver that bellicose speech of his, and only then declare war? Why did he not do so immediately? Well, it's difficult to speculate on exact motives, and you can't know for sure, but Hale offers what I think is a rather plausible explanation, and that is this. Roosevelt had in mind the memory and the experience of his hero Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war immediately after the Lusitania was attacked. This was he asked for a declaration of war on April 2nd, 1917, and Congress debated for 4 days and did not give him the declaration of war that he wanted until April 6th, 1917. This 4-day period of debate eventually led to many recriminations and denunciations against Wilson later on as the war progressed. Roosevelt did not want to make this mistake. He wanted to avoid this. He, of course, realized that given the widespread belief that Germany was ultimately the power behind the throne, so to speak, and that it was ultimately responsible for the Pearl Harbor attack, was enough to give him a majority. It was enough to get the majority of the American public to support him, and it was enough to get a majority of representatives in Congress to give him the declaration of war he sought. But he decided that if he were to sit back and wait for Germany to declare war on the United States, which he was confident it would do given the fact that Germany was allied with Japan, this fact, this German declaration of war, would then essentially take the last few stragglers who were still against him and push them to his side and give him just about unanimous support, which would then give him more leeway in carrying out policy as he saw fit. So that essentially is why he waited. Now, after Pearl Harbor, the members of Roosevelt's cabinet, immediately after the attack, immediately afterward, possibly as shortly afterward as a few minutes or a few hours afterward, began urging him to come out before long and make a public declaration to the effect that Germany was essentially ultimately responsible for the war. Although Japan carried it out, it was under German command, it was under German orders. Now, what's interesting is all of Roosevelt's administration was comprised of screaming war hawks. They were all hawkish. The most hawkish of them was Henry Stimson, Secretary of War. And Stimson was so hawkish, in fact, that he not only wanted the United States to declare war on Germany after Pearl Harbor, he was in favor of such a declaration of war even before the Pearl Harbor attack. Roosevelt, of course, did not listen to Stimson's advice on this because he correctly perceived that he wouldn't be able to get away with such a thing. Now, in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt did have a conversation with his cabinet, and Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State, urged him to come out and make a public declaration connecting Germany to Japan, weaving threads that would bring them together in the minds of the American public, in the minds of the journalistic class, in the minds of congressional leaders. And he did precisely this in a speech that he issued on December 9th. Now, on December 9th, Roosevelt began to speak of, to use his phrase, actual collaboration between Germany and Japan. He began to say that the Germans, the Japanese were acting under the behest of the Germans. He also implied in different parts of the speech that they were equal partners in, an evil master plan to conquer the world. He was essentially adopting both of the theories that would become prevalent in the wake of Pearl Harbor and that were declared everywhere throughout the American press at this time. The one was the puppet master theory, which held that Germany essentially controlled Japan and that Japan acted on German orders when it attacked Pearl Harbor, and the other was the equal partner theory, which held that they were, equal partners. That while Japan did attack on its own might and by its own decision, Germany and Japan were partners in a grand, struggle to conquer the world or what have you, and they did plan this attack jointly. So Roosevelt essentially espoused both of these theories in his speech. Now, what's astonishing is, and I want to read this quote to you because it really just showcases what a completely blatant and shameless liar FDR was in this regard. Because keep in mind that what I'm going to read, the declaration from him that I'm going to read, has no evidence to support it whatsoever at this time. There's no evidence for it, and in fact there was never found any evidence for it. So I'm going to read this now. Your government knows that for weeks Germany has been telling Japan that if Japan did not attack the United States, Japan would not share in dividing the spoils with Germany when peace came. She was promised by Germany that if she came in, she would receive the complete and perpetual control of the whole of the Pacific area, and that means not only the Far East, but also of the islands of the Pacific, and also a stranglehold on the west coast of North, Central, and South America. We know also that Germany and Japan are conducting their military and naval operations in accordance with a joint plan. That plan considers all peoples and all nations which are not helping the Axis powers as common enemies of each and every one of the Axis powers. That is their simple and obvious grand strategy. So think of the gall of this man to declare such a thing simple and obvious when he had no evidence for it, to declare that he had military intelligence to this effect when in fact he had none. Because remember, after the war, the German archives were opened and there was found no evidence whatsoever that the Germans induced Japan to attack Pearl Harbor. In fact, what was found was that when the attack happened, Hitler was surprised. Hitler was surprised and he was worried because he understood that the attack would bring the United States into the war, and that was the last thing he wanted. But, of course, that didn't stop Roosevelt and those around him, and it certainly didn't stop many of the supposedly trustworthy journalists that were around from spreading this lie in much the same shameless way. Now, what's interesting is after he made this speech, the newspapers from everywhere, just pounced on it. They tried to analyze it left and right. I'll give you a perfect example. Here's the Salt Lake Tribune speaking about Roosevelt's speech. The Tribune editorialized that, quote, "Almost every citizen who has given the matter any consideration at all felt that Nazi prodding had forced Tokyo to act without warning, while intelligent, unbiased Americans almost unanimously held this opinion. The Chief Executive and Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army and Navy has had documentary evidence, lie, of the accuracy of such an appraisal. In his address Tuesday evening, he verified the suspicions of his countrymen." He had no evidence. This was a lie. It was made up. Now, what else is interesting is that once these fears of German involvement in Pearl Harbor had taken hold, the hysteria, of course, grew. Before long, reports started to appear in newspapers all over the country that German planes had been sighted around Pearl Harbor, that they'd been seen flying around Hawaii, that they'd seen planes with German markings, with swastikas on them, that German shtukas were found. Some people even claimed that they saw blonde-haired pilots sitting in the cockpits of some of these planes, and they said that when some of the planes were shot down, they found German, people that looked German, European-looking people, I suppose, blonde-haired people, amid the wreckage. And none of these reports were ever confirmed, and of course, how could they have been? And there were no German planes there, the whole thing was made up. But these reports did exist and were propagated for quite a while. Now, it's true that starting in January 1942, these reports began to decrease in frequency, but this doesn't necessarily imply that the theory was discarded or that the American public at large no longer believed it. Keep in mind that none of the newspapers that propagated this nonsense ever issued even a single retraction of any of their claims, and it might just well be that this sort of thing had become an unquestioned assumption, just ingrained into the minds of Americans, and everyone just sort of assumed this, and maybe it wasn't reported any further in the American press because it didn't seem necessary to do so. All the indications seem to be that at least throughout the war, at least some section of the American public believed that Germany was directly involved. And this varied throughout the war, but the belief persisted throughout, and really didn't disappear until the war ended and the German archives were opened and no evidence to this effect was discovered. What else is interesting, and what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, is the hysteria surrounding the German fleet, specifically a few of their battleships. Most prominently, the battleship Tirpitz, which was this gigantic ship that the Germans had, that every American was so terrified of at this time. Now, the reason that this hysteria around Pearl Harbor Month was so prevalent was that essentially the American public had been being prepped for this by journalists. They'd been seeing reports of German aggressiveness on the high seas for a long time up to that point. The latest report antedating Pearl Harbor was one on December 3rd, which talked about a German ship, the Steiermark, and a conflict that it had fallen into with an Australian ship, the Sydney. The Steiermark had sunk the Sydney, and this was again played up as an example of German aggressiveness. Interventionists took up this story and many others to lend credence to their belief that the Germans were planning an invasion of the United States. There were actually some that believed that the Germans were planning to land at Brazil and then come up through South America and attack the United States that way. I'm not making it up. This was a serious theory. This was actually believed. So there were all these reports about where the German fleet was, and essentially they exploded into full-blown fear and mania after December 3rd, when the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, gave a press conference to this effect. And Knox said that there had been reports of sightings of German battleships in the Pacific, the Gneisenau, the Tirpitz, and so on. He was very ambiguous in his statement, but of course everyone jumped on it. And then after Pearl Harbor, once you add in the near universal belief that Germany was ultimately responsible for the attack, as you can imagine, there were so many reports about the location of the German fleet, about where the Tirpitz was, where the Steiermark was, where the Gneisenau was, where all these other ships were. Among many other things that were done, was, the danger posed by the German fleet was exaggerated in many ways. I'll give you a few examples. In February 1942, the Chicago Tribune ran a story in which it quoted Senator Guy Gillette, who said that he had been made aware of certain documents as early as October 1941, testifying to the fact that Hitler had actually promised the Japanese military aid by, at the latest, February 1942. And that should the Japanese find it expedient to attack the United States in order to create some sort of a diversion, Hitler would by that time be able to provide them with military support. Now, given the story said further that given the American embargo, the American oil embargo on Japan, Japan decided that it needed to attack earlier, and so attacked on December, and that Hitler had ultimately given his approval for this, because at around the same time, all the advances that Hitler had been making on the European and the North African front were essentially being undone. The Nazis were being pushed back, and Hitler was losing ground, and he said that he needed some sort of diversion. He needed the Japanese to attack the United States so that Allied resources could be diverted to that conflict and allow Hitler to recoup his losses. So the story went, and this senator, Guy Gillette, claims to have known about this since at least October, and claims to have received credible intelligence that that Japan would attack the United States either in December 1941 or February 1942. And I mean, this was just ridiculous. Like, he knew all of this, and only now he decided to say something. How strange. So I don't think you can ascribe much in the way of veracity to it. And furthermore, fears of the German Navy were greatly exaggerated by the fact that a lot of the information for the American reports regarding the German Navy came from two main sources. One was, get ready for this, Stalin, because he's trustworthy, and the other was were the British, the two countries that were at war with Hitler at the time. And nobody seemed to doubt the validity of these sources. Nobody seemed to doubt their accuracy. Everyone seemed to join together in a perfect chorus of harmony and just say that they were trustworthy. And in fact, there were many declarations and many articles in the American press to the effect that the information they were reporting in their article about the German fleet had come from, quote, a reliable source. It was never said who that source was, and it was only later discovered that it was a combination of Stalin and the British. It was Stalin, for example, that basically put into circulation the rumor that the Japanese had been receiving German technology. It was in part Stalin also who started the rumors about the presence of German warplanes in Pearl Harbor. So that all came from him. And the other astonishing thing is that by the time that these reports were flooding in, the British had actually broken the German Enigma code and were reading and intercepting German messages. This meant that they knew exactly where the German fleet was, where the Tirpitz was, where the Prinz Eugen was, the Scharnhorst, the Gneisenau, all of their major ships. And yet they deliberately fed to the American press lies in this regard. Now, I don't want to imply by this that the Americans were somehow innocent, that they were the dupes of the British. Mind you, no American journalist felt any urge to question the reports that were being received from Britain. But the fact of the matter is, the British had broken the German Enigma code, and they knew that on December 6th, the day before the Pearl Harbor attack, the Tirpitz was positioned somewhere, was holed up somewhere in Norway. Now, if it was in Norway the day before, it's simply not believable that it could have made it past the British blockade to the Pacific, and then back again, once again sneaking past the British blockade to get within the area of the blockade, fooling the British twice, not having them notice it, and doing so in such a short time. This is simply a ridiculous story. And yet, despite all of this, the stories persisted. There were also stories like one that I'm going to quote to you now. For example, this is, I believe, in the, here we go, the New York Times. This article from the New York Times was published on December 14th, and it was about alleged sightings of the Japanese making use of four-engined planes. Planes that could traverse incredibly long distances, and planes for which it was believed that the Japanese lacked the technology to man and fuel and so forth, thus leading to the theory that it was the Germans who were supplying them with their technology. So the New York Times, December 14th, says, reports from Hawaii that four-engine Japanese planes took part in the assault on Pearl Harbor have not been confirmed. If such craft were used, the assumption is that they flew from land bases. Four-engine bombers are not launched from airplane carriers. Germany, however, has two catapult ships that launch four-engine planes, and there is a possibility that they may be in the Pacific. Back in 1938, these two German surface vessels, the Schwabenland and the Frieseland, catapulted three four-engine 17-ton planes from their decks many times for survey flights between Europe and America. Now, notice, the New York Times article said that this was not confirmed, and of course, they couldn't confirm any of these reports. There was no evidence for them. This did not stop them from irresponsibly trumpeting them, of course, and haggling and calling for war. But I mean, don't let the evidence keep a good war propagandist down, right? Now, there were even some reports about the German fleet that that weren't even consistent among one another. For example, Time magazine reported that what happened was in February 1942, a number of German ships, the Gneisenau, the Scharnhorst, and the Prinz Eugen, actually broke the British blockade. They got through it. And the significance of this was trumpeted up. This was seen as an enormous danger. It was referred to as the Channel Dash. It was greatly exaggerated. And it caused Time magazine to say that these three ships, Gneisenau, Scharnhorst, and Prinz Eugen, would now be able to link up with the Tirpitz, the Admiral Scheer, the Lutzow, the Graf Zeppelin, and the Deutschland, as well as the rest of the German Navy, and launch an assault on the United States from the Pacific and possibly also from the Atlantic as well. Now, the ridiculous thing about this claim is that these last two ships, the Graf Zeppelin and the Deutschland, were at this time not even built. They were still in German shipyards being constructed. And yet, this was reported. There were also reports to the effect that Hitler had promised to co-opt the French fleet, have it be manned by Germans and send it over to the Pacific to assist the Japanese. Again, this was not substantiated. Mind you, all the sources from this came from Stalin and from the British. And the British had broken the Enigma code, so they knew better. They were lying. And American journalists did not think to question it. Roosevelt did not think to quell these fires of hysteria. None of this was done. And in fact, the fear really didn't even begin to abate until December 15th, when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox held another press conference in which he said that there really is no real evidence of any kind of German presence or involvement in the Pacific. Now, different newspapers, depending on their either interventionist or non-interventionist proclivities, reacted to this in different ways. So, for example, the Atlanta Journal, which was a heavily interventionist newspaper, did not even mention this statement by Knox. It reported on his press conference, but did not even mention that he said this. And it is true that Knox was very ambiguous, and that when he said this, he only said it in response to a question asked by a reporter. He did not include it at all anywhere in his prepared remarks. But all the same, the Atlanta Journal did not mention it. On the other hand, the New York Daily News, which is a formerly isolationist paper, began to question the validity of these accusations of a German presence. He said, well, there you have it. Knox essentially said there's no evidence, so let's not blame the Germans for this anymore. Of course, by then it was too late, because, as I said, Knox's press conference was on the 15th. Now, as this went on, one prominent article, for example, published in the Saturday Evening Post, was so skeptical that it not only questioned the idea that there might have been a German presence in the Pacific at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, but it even went so far as to question whether Germany was assisting Japan at all. So, for example, we have the Post saying this: when the Japanese struck, we Americans had been so thoroughly oversold on the conception of an unbreakable axis that we saw Germans behind every lamppost in the Pacific. We heard first that German aviators had been active at Pearl Harbor, and we believed that report until our own Secretary of the Navy assured us that it wasn't true. Then we heard that it was Germans who had sunk 2 British battleships off Malaya, and credited that report until an American eyewitness told us it was false. It required some time for us to be convinced that the war in the Pacific was a predominantly Japanese show. Now, despite the emergence at long last of these kind of bits of skepticism in the American press, I want to emphasize that these sorts of opinions were still very much minority opinions, and the majority of articles published at this time still continued to trumpet the line of war propaganda. I only really want to bring it up because it shows that at least there was some skepticism emerging. Now, what else is interesting, and this is really astonishing. This is something that I couldn't believe, that I didn't know, that I want to talk about now, was that in just a few days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the belief that the Germans were responsible was so complete that the FBI took immediate action. Now, we all know about how Japanese citizens were rounded up in the United States and placed in internment camps. What is not as well known is that the same thing was done to German and Italian aliens. And the astonishing thing is the FBI commenced its arrests not only of Japanese aliens, but of Germans and Italians as well, before the German declaration of war. Before the German declaration of war. So, for example, you have this. I'm just going to read from Hill, because this is truly shocking. It says, the FBI arrests of suspected German enemy aliens were reported by the AP, that's the Associated Press, and carried in the December 9th morning papers. On December 10th, the press reported that as of December 9th, the FBI had arrested 400 Germans and Italians. On December 11th, the Cincinnati Enquirer reported that as of December 10th, the FBI had arrested 1,291 Japanese, 865 Germans, 147 Italians. Again, this is all going on before the declaration. Now, what else is interesting is that Roosevelt issued an executive order authorizing the FBI to do all of this, and this executive order was published on December 9th. Now, if it was published on December 9th, well, I mean, it means it must have been going on for at least a little while before then. But just, quoting the executive order here, it says, I, Franklin D. Roosevelt, as President of the United States and as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, do hereby make public proclamation to all who may concern that an invasion or predatory incursion is threatened upon the territory of the United States by Germany. By Germany. By Germany. It's astonishing. Now, I could continue to sit here and quote all the various lies that were sold. And you could make objections to many other things that I said. Well, Germany was dangerous and so forth. The fact is, although I'm not going to discuss it, Hitler had been trying very hard to prevent the United States from entering the war. He was very conciliatory to the United States. And by the time that the United States eventually entered the war, the tide had turned against Hitler. He was losing, and I sort of hinted that a lot of the articles published at this time in the American press understood this. Only they held that the fact that the tide was turning against Hitler indicated that he wanted the Japanese to attack the United States and create a diversion. Though how exactly this would benefit Hitler when he was losing on the fronts that he was fighting was never made clear. And there was all sorts of division at this time. You have to understand that war hysteria was rampant. Some people believed that the Germans were directly responsible. Others wanted to wait for evidence to come in. Eventually, as a lot of the unconfirmed reports remained unconfirmed, people's skepticism began to grow. And eventually there emerged some group of people who said, well, perhaps it might be that Germany has not yet overtly attacked the United States, but it will soon. Well, if Germany hasn't yet attacked the United States, if they're correct in this, then the United States then has no casus belli against Germany. Remember, all the previous quote from Roosevelt in the opinion polls that I mentioned, that the American people opposed any kind of declaration of war on Germany, absent an overt act of war, an overt attack by Germany on the territory of the United States. If this hadn't happened, there's no reason to go to war. But of course, this elementary bit of logic didn't seem to occur to anyone. There were others who said that, Germany was aiding Japan by providing them with technology. Well, the United States was aiding China and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. Is that therefore a sufficient reason for Germany and Japan to declare war on the United States? Again, this was not considered. Just all sorts of horrible things, all sorts of lies were told in the wake of this hysteria. But the fact remains that on December 12th, the Germans either denied or rescinded their declaration of war, depending on how you want to interpret it. And the American press acknowledged this and declared it unimportant because Germany attacked Pearl Harbor, because Hitler ordered the attack. Now, as I said, there were essentially two different theories. One, the puppet master thesis. The other was the equal partner thesis. And as time went on and neither could be fully collaborated, the opinion began to grow in acceptance that no one really knew, and it was better to be safe than sorry and declare war anyway. It's really fascinating to see how all the members of the press were just coming up with these ad hoc explanations and hypotheses and mangling the evidence in any way they could to make it seem like a declaration of war on Germany by the United States was justifiable. And remember also that historians in the wake of this have said nothing about it. Hill's book is the only book that I know of that even mentions the fact that the climate of opinion was this way in the United States at all. Historians today ignore this. History has essentially been rewritten. And this is why I felt compelled to make this video, because I think what's in this book is incredibly important. So we know all of this. We know all of these lies. We know all of this nonsense that has been propagated. So, what do we do now? Well, it's clear that when you deal with the government, when you deal with the state, you deal with people for whom the ends truly justify the means. And the end for people like FDR and Stimson and Cordell Hull and all the rest of his Warhawk friends was power. That was the end in itself. That was what they truly, truly wanted. And they would work to achieve it really by any means necessary, by lying, by claiming they had evidence when they didn't have it, by refusing to quell hysteria when they knew that there was no basis for it. And I guess I just want to end this with a few remarks. You see, for a long time, a YouTube user by the name of lengthyounarther has been goading me, exhorting me to make videos, and he's also said this about a lot of his subscribers. He said that everyone has their own unique perspective to offer, and of course, he's right. The fact is, I have no excuse for having stayed silent for this long. But it's more than this. When you realize that the degree of falsehood, the degree of deception was so widespread in the media, in something that people are told is trustworthy and are supposed to revere and regard as accurate, and you see all this kind of nonsense being propagated by these organs. It's astonishing what it leads to. I mean, look at World War II. It's the most brutal, bloody, destructive, horrendous war in the history of humankind. And in part, the devastation of it was wrought by these liars, by these lying parasites sitting at the top and their eager apologists, the journalists, who are desperate to lick their boots and proclaim any lie as gospel so long as it benefits the masters. It's pathetic. But now things are different than they were in the 1940s. Now we have the internet. Now information is much more abundant. Now, when lies like this are spread, we can speak out and we can say something. So, what I want to say to all of you is, look at World War II. Look at this horrendous, destructive conflict. Look at all the loss of life. Look at all the blood spilled and all the destruction. When you contemplate this, what can you possibly say other than fuck FDR and Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler and General Tojo and any lying asshole that has ever aspired to political power for its own sake from the moment that humanity crawled out of the slime? Fuck Dorothy Thompson and James Reston and Walter Lippmann and all of these other so-called journalists, their pathetic contemporaries who cared more for fomenting war hysteria and spreading propaganda than they did for doing their jobs. And fuck every single one of their pitiful contemporaries who behave in the same disgusting and dishonorable manner today. So today, when you see lies like this being spread, when you see any one of the army of professional liars that the state has either directly or indirectly in its employ spreading falsehoods like this, then you stand up and you speak. Because if you don't, bullshit, like what's in this book, what's described in this book, wins. And when bullshit wins, whether you realize it or not, you lose. Because the only thing that has ever resulted from bullshit carrying the day, from a victory for bullshit like this, has been the creation of an increasingly regimented, increasingly controlled, increasingly less free, increasingly more statist, and increasingly shittier world in which millions of innocent people are carted off and sent to die like they're nothing. And those who are lucky enough not to be slaughtered outright are not even allowed to live in the way that they deserve to live, in a way that respects and dignifies the humanity in them and acknowledges that they are free creatures. So when you see lies like this being spread and you know them to be lies, then you take what you know and you bellow it from the highest mountaintop to anyone who will listen. And you do this without ceasing, without stopping, without abating, without relenting, until finally the glorious day comes when no one believes them anymore. And when that day comes, when that glorious day finally comes, well then, maybe, just maybe, we can all be free. Thank you for listening.